Most of you do not want to be happy. You want to be comfortable, you want to be amused, and above all, you want to be spared. But the moment you are spared all friction, all tragedy, and all real pain, your soul begins to rot from the inside out. Let that sit for a second. We live in an era obsessed with the eradication of discomfort. Therapy culture, self-care routines, pharmacotherapy, and algorithmic isolation are all engineered toward a singular, frictionless utopia, a life where you never have to hurt. We treat suffering like a design flaw in the human machine. But what if pain isn't a malfunction? What if it is the primary manufacturer of depth, consciousness, and authenticity? Enter Fyodor Dostoevsky. Written from the darkest trenches of epileptic seizures, mock execution, Siberian hard labor, and crippling gambling addictions, his works do not offer you a safe space. They offer you a mirror. And what Dostoevsky discovered long before modern psychiatry coined terms like post-traumatic growth is a terrifying psychological truth. There is a specific kind of profound human depth that can only be forged in the furnace of suffering. If you bypass the pain, you bypass the person you were meant to become. To understand Dostoevsky's psychology of suffering is to dismantle the modern worship of comfort. Drawing from notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment, and the brothers Karamazov, this script explores why human beings frequently sabotage their own happiness, why psychological agony is often the birth canal of self-awareness, and how confronting our deepest wounds transforms us from superficial actors into complex, authentic individuals. We will examine the cognitive mechanisms of guilt, the paradox of existential freedom through hardship, and why the unexamined, painless life ultimately reduces the human psyche to a flat, predictable echo chamber. Prepare to rethink everything you know about pain, healing, and what it truly means to be alive. To truly understand why human beings often cling to their own misery, we have to travel deep down into the dark, damp, and uncomfortable basement of the human mind. Long before modern psychologists began mapping out neuroses, defense mechanisms, and trauma bonds, Fyodor Dostoevsky built an entire literary world around a startling and deeply disturbing psychological truth. He realized that human beings do not just tolerate pain. In many cases, we secretly cherish our wounds. We protect them, we nurse them, and we refuse to let them go, even when holding on to them is destroying our lives. Think about the way most people assume the world works. For centuries, smart thinkers and philosophers operated on a very clean and logical equation. They believe that human beings are fundamentally rational creatures who want to be happy. They assume that if you give people comfort, safety, security, and pleasure, they will naturally take it and thrive. They believe that every single human action is just an attempt to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. It sounds like common sense, right? If you put a button in front of someone that stops their physical or emotional pain forever, they are going to slam their hand down on it. Dostoevsky looked at this neat, comfortable mathematical formula and laughed right in our faces. In his groundbreaking 1864 novella, Notes from Underground, he introduced a character known only as the Underground Man. The Underground Man is bitter, isolated, deeply insecure, and furiously intelligent. He spends his days sitting in his damp, dirty apartment in St. Petersburg, brooding over slights, replaying old humiliations, and tearing apart the comforting illusions of modern society. He launches a vicious, unforgettable assault on the idea that humans always act in their own best interest. The Underground Man argues that humanity possesses a hidden, highly irrational desire that completely wrecks all our utopian blueprints and self-help guides. That desire is the human craving for suffering. He states plainly that man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately attached to suffering, and that this is an absolute fact of human nature. From a clinical or logical standpoint, this sounds completely insane. Why would any psychological organism deliberately cling to distress? Why would you hold on to something that hurts? Dostoevsky answers this through a profound psychological insight that modern psychology has spent the last century trying to catch up with. Suffering is proof of consciousness. Think about what happens when your life is completely comfortable, safe, predictable, and frictionless. When you have no problems, when your bills are paid, when nobody is arguing with you, and when your days stretch out in front of you with absolute safety, what happens to your mind? After a while, you stop feeling much at all. You become numb. You begin to feel like a ghost, or like a single piano key being pounded by the blind, unfeeling laws of nature. You feel utterly insignificant, interchangeable, and gray. But the moment you suffer, everything changes. Pain wakes you up. Emotional agony, grief, betrayal, and humiliation tear through the numbing fog of daily routine and grab you by the throat. When you hurt, you know you are alive. Your ego is bruised, your nerves are firing on all cylinders, and you are forced to confront reality. Dostoevsky understood that for many people, living a life of quiet, numbing comfort feels like a slow psychological death. Pain, therefore, becomes the ultimate antidote to emotional numbness. We would rather feel the sharp, agonizing burn of misery than feel nothing at all, because misery at least proves that we exist as unique, independent human beings. This brings us to a darker and more complex mechanism of the human mind that Dostoevsky maps out with terrifying accuracy. This is the pathology of resentment and inertia. The underground man suffers intensely, but if you look closely at his behavior, you realize that he is not just a passive victim of bad luck. He is actively, aggressively cultivating his own misery. He spends hours engineering scenarios where he can feel insulted, rejected, or misunderstood, just so he can retreat back into his corner and lick his wounds like a proud, wounded animal. In modern psychological terms, we call this secondary gain. Secondary gain happens when an individual derives unconscious, hidden benefits from being sick, wounded, or miserable. On the surface, you might complain endlessly about your broken heart, your terrible job, or your abusive family. You might tell everyone how much you want things to change, but underneath the surface, your misery is actually doing a lot of heavy lifting for you. It is protecting you. It is giving you something you desperately need, even if you are too proud to admit it. For the underground man, his suffering gives him several major psychological payoffs. First, it gives him a twisted kind of moral superiority. Because he is miserable and the rest of the world is happily running around chasing money, status, and shallow pleasures, he can look down on them. He convinces himself that his suffering makes him deeper, more intellectual, and more authentic than the happy, simple-minded people out there. His wounds become a badge of honor. He is not a loser. He is a tragic philosopher, living in a fallen world. Second, his suffering serves as a brilliant shield against risk. As long as the underground man is broken, miserable, and alienated, he has a built-in excuse for why he never achieves anything. He never has to step out into the terrifying arena of real life, real relationships, and real work. He never has to risk failure, rejection, or looking foolish in front of other people. Why try to get a promotion, make a friend, or find love when you are already too damaged for the world? Your misery becomes a cozy, protective fortress. It is a miserable fortress, to be sure, but it has locked doors, and inside those walls, you never have to face the terrifying unknown. Third, suffering provides a ready-made narrative. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We desperately need our lives to make sense, and we need our identities to have a clear, dramatic arc. If you have no trauma, no deep wounds, and no grand struggles, who are you? What is your story? For many people, their pain is their autobiography. Take away their suffering, and their entire identity collapses into a terrifying vacuum. They do not know who they are without their wounds. This is why Dostoevsky exposes such a dark and uncomfortable truth about human nature. We often prefer a familiar, predictable hell over an uncertain, terrifying growth. Giving up your suffering means giving up the entire identity you have built around it. It means admitting that you are partly responsible for your own stagnation. It means stepping out of the warm bath of self-pity and walking naked into the cold wind of personal responsibility. That requires an immense amount of courage, which is precisely why the vast majority of people choose to stay comfortably, predictably miserable for their entire lives. When you look at human behavior through this Dostoevskian lens, a lot of things that normally make no sense suddenly become crystal clear. You start to see why people stay in toxic relationships year after year, complaining bitterly to their friends, yet sabotaging every attempt to leave. Leaving means entering the unknown, facing loneliness, and rebuilding an identity from scratch. Staying means holding on to a familiar wound that gives them drama, sympathy, and a ready-made excuse. You start to see why people hold on to old grudges like precious family heirlooms. A grudge gives you a permanent villain in your story, a constant source of righteous anger that keeps you warm on cold nights. Letting go of the grudge means forgiving, forgetting, and moving on, which leaves a dangerous, open space where the pain used to be. Dostoevsky is not telling us this to make us feel hopeless. He is holding up a mirror so we can stop lying to ourselves. He is forcing us to look at the ways we secretly sabotage our own happiness because our happiness feels too fragile, too demanding, or too unfamiliar. We use our wounds as shields, as excuses, and as anchors to keep us safely moored to the bottom of the ocean, terrified of what might happen if we ever actually cut the rope and floated up toward the light. As you reflect on your own life, look closely at the areas where you feel stuck, frustrated, or in pain. Ask yourself the hard, Dostoevskian question: what am I getting out of this? What does this wound protect me from? What identity am I maintaining by holding on to this suffering? Until you have the courage to look at those hidden secondary gains, your pain will continue to master you. You will keep nursing your wounds in the dark, mistaking the familiar ache of your own misery for the deep, pulsing heartbeat of a truly meaningful life. If the underground psychology of resentment shows us how people freeze themselves in place with petty grievances and self-imposed isolation, Dostoevsky takes us somewhere infinitely more terrifying in his masterwork Crime and Punishment. Here, he explores what happens when a human being crosses an ultimate moral line and tries to live completely outside the boundaries of human conscience. We move from the damp, pathetic basement of the mind into the burning, feverish courtroom of the human soul. This is where Dostoevsky examines the true engine of psychological transformation, proving that guilt is not just an annoying emotional inconvenience, but the brutal, fiery furnace in which a real soul is forged. To understand this journey, we have to look at the main character, Rodion Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov is a brilliant, impoverished former university student living in a cramped, coffin-like room in St. Petersburg. He has completely isolated himself from the world, staring at the ceiling for hours, spinning wild intellectual theories in his head. He is a young man who has lived entirely inside his own thoughts for so long that he has lost touch with basic human reality. In this state of intellectual starvation and extreme pride, he invents a dangerous, intoxicating philosophy. Raskolnikov divides the entire human race into two distinct categories. On one side are the ordinary people, the vast majority of humanity, who are timid, obedient, and meant to live within the established rules, laws, and moral traditions of society. They keep the peace, they follow the rules, and they maintain the structure of civilization. But on the other side, Raskolnikov places the extraordinary people. These are the rare, towering figures of history, people like Napoleon Bonaparte, who possess such immense intellect and willpower that they are legally and morally permitted to step over conventional boundaries, break traditional laws, and even shed blood if it is necessary to achieve a greater, world-changing goal. In Raskolnikov's twisted mental calculus, an extraordinary man has the right to step over a corpse or eliminate an obstacle if his grand vision demands it. To prove to himself that he belongs to this elite, fearless category of extraordinary men, Raskolnikov hatches a plan. He decides to murder an old, cynical pawnbroker who hoards money and treats people poorly. In his mind, she is nothing more than a harmful louse, a useless parasite on society. He convinces himself that by killing her, he can take her money, use it to rescue his impoverished family, pay off his debts, and eventually spend the rest of his life doing great, noble deeds that will wash away the single transgression. It is a completely cold, calculated, intellectual experiment. He treats murder like a math problem or a chess move. He believes he can execute the crime, walk away, and keep his mind completely steady, secure in his superior philosophy. He commits the murder with an axe, but right as he finishes, things spiral out of control. He is forced to kill the pawnbroker's innocent, gentle-hearted sister, Lizaveta, who walks in unexpectedly and catches him in the act. He manages to escape with a few stolen trinkets and some cash, which he frantically hides under a rock without even looking at them, and stumbles back to his room. This is where the real story begins. This is where Dostoevsky delivers one of the most brilliant, profound explorations of human psychology ever written, long before Sigmund Freud or any modern psychoanalyst ever drew a map of the human mind. Raskolnikov thinks his problems are entirely external. He worries that someone saw him on the stairs, that the police are watching him, or that a suspicious detective will corner him. But Dostoevsky shows us something much more profound. Raskolnikov does not break down because of the police or external surveillance. He breaks down because of his own internal architecture, because of that deep, stubborn, unyielding thing we call the conscience. The human mind is not a machine that can simply reprogram its own moral code just because a smart young man writes an essay about it. Deep down, beneath all the layers of intellectual arrogance and philosophical rationalization, Raskolnikov's soul knows exactly what he has done. Almost immediately, a violent, agonizing psychological disintegration begins to take over his entire body and mind. Dostoevsky illustrates how unexpiated guilt manifests itself not just as a bad feeling, but as a total, overwhelming psychosomatic crisis. Raskolnikov is struck down by a massive, burning fever. He falls into long stretches of delirium, tossing and turning in his bed, hallucinating, sweating, and losing touch with reality. His body is literally rejecting the crime. The psychological weight of what he has done is so toxic, so heavy, that his physical organism cannot handle it. When he is awake, his life turns into a living nightmare of paranoia. Every single casual remark, dropped by a stranger on the street, feels like a trap designed to expose him. When he visits a police office to talk about a completely unrelated matter, a stray comment or a sudden look makes his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird, nearly causing him to faint. He pushes away his loving mother and his devoted sister, because he cannot bear the agonizing contrast between their pure affection and the dark, bloody secret screaming inside his chest. He completely alienates his only friend, Razumikin, isolating himself in a cage of terror and self-loathing. Think about what is happening here on a deeper psychological level. Raskolnikov tried to play God. He tried to use his intellect to rewrite the fundamental moral laws of human existence, assuming that his ego was strong enough to survive the murder of another human being. But Dostoevsky is showing us that the human conscience is not a social construct that you can just intellectualize away. It is a fundamental, non-negotiable part of what makes us human. When you violate it, you do not just break a rule, you fracture your own psyche. You tear apart the very foundation of your identity, leaving yourself stranded in a desolate wasteland of alienation and self-hatred. For months, Raskolnikov wanders through St. Petersburg like a ghost. He is trapped in a mental prison that is infinitely worse than any brick-and-mortar cell the Russian government could ever build for him. He tries to cling to his original theory, telling himself that he is still an extraordinary man, that he only failed because he was weak, nerveux, because he lacked the iron constitution of a true conqueror. But his rationalizations are crumbling. They sound hollow even to him. His pride has been beaten down, his intellect has been thoroughly defeated, and he is left standing in the ruins of his own grand illusions. It is only when he hits rock bottom that the possibility of genuine transformation appears, and it comes in a way he least expects. It arrives through Sonia, a young woman who has been forced into prostitution to feed her starving family, enduring unimaginable humiliation, poverty, and social rejection. Yet, despite the brutal degradation of her daily life, Sonia has retained a remarkably pure, sacrificial, and loving soul. She is the living embodiment of Christian love and empathy. Raskolnikov is drawn to her, and eventually, driven by his unbearable mental agony, he confesses his terrible crime to her. What does Sonia do when she hears that the man sitting across from her is a murderer? She does not scream, she does not call the police, and she does not lecture him with righteous anger. Instead, she trembles with horror, bursts into tears, throws her arms around his neck, and agrees to share his suffering. She tells him that he must go to the public square, bow down to the earth, kiss the ground that he has defiled, and confess his crime to the world so that he can take up his cross and begin the long, agonizing process of atonement. This brings us to the core psychological thesis of Dostoevsky's work. Guilt is not a disease to be instantly medicated away, and it is not a mistake to be explained away by clever philosophy. Guilt is a sacred alarm system. It is the undeniable proof that the soul is still alive. If Raskolnikov had committed a brutal double murder and felt absolutely nothing, if he had simply shrugged his shoulders, collected the money, and gone on with his life without a single pang of remorse, he would have truly been a monster. He would have crossed the line from a deeply flawed human being into a completely hollow, soulless shell of a man. His excruciating psychological agony, his fevers, his nightmares, and his overwhelming remorse are actually the signs of spiritual life. They are the friction required to break his hardened, narcissistic ego. Raskolnikov eventually turns himself into the authorities and is sentenced to hard labor in Siberia. But notice that his story does not end with his punishment, it ends with his rebirth. In the harsh, freezing environment of the Siberian prison camp, surrounded by hardened criminals who initially despise him for his arrogance, Raskolnikov continues to suffer immensely. He clings to his pride for a long time, refusing to repent, despising the other convicts, and feeling like an exiled intellectual among common brutes. His ego dies a very slow, painful death. It is only through years of physical labor, profound loneliness, and the steady, patient, unconditional love of Sonia, who follows him to Siberia and waits outside the prison gates, that the hard shell around his heart finally cracks open for good. One day, sitting on the banks of a wide, sunlit Siberian river, looking out across the vast, empty steppes, something shifts inside him. The intellectual theories evaporate completely. The pride that has tortured him for years simply melts away. He realizes how deeply he loves Sonia, and he realizes how much he has missed out on life through his stubborn, destructive arrogance. Dostoevsky shows us through this epic psychological arc that you cannot think your way into a meaningful life. You cannot outsmart your own conscience, and you cannot bypass the deep, necessary pain of moral reckoning. When we do wrong, when we hurt others, or when we violate our deepest values, our minds will inevitably fracture under the weight of that guilt. Most people try to escape that pain through more rationalizations, distractions, or denial, keeping themselves trapped in a state of half-conscious misery. But Dostoevsky insists that we must walk straight through the fire of our own guilt. We must let our false pride be burned away. We must bear the heavy cross of our mistakes, and we must allow our illusions to be completely destroyed. Only through that total psychological collapse can the ego be truly humbled, making way for a genuine, lasting transformation and the birth of a real, deep, compassionate human soul. When we move from the tight personal nightmare of Raskolnikov's individual guilt in Crime and Punishment to Fyodor Dostoevsky's final and greatest masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, the lens of his psychology widens to cover the entire scope of the human condition. Here, Dostoevsky takes up a question that haunts every single person who has ever tried to figure out what they want out of life. Are we actually built to handle true freedom, or do we secretly spend all our energy trying to run away from it? To answer this, he drops us right into one of the most famous, brilliant, and chilling passages in all of world literature, known as the legend of the Grand Inquisitor. Imagine a scene set in 16th century Spain during the darkest days of the Spanish Inquisition. Fires are burning in the town squares, heretics are being tortured and burned at the stake, and the atmosphere is thick with absolute authority, fear, and religious control. Into this tense, terrified world, Jesus Christ quietly returns. He does not announce himself with trumpets or thunder. He walks among the people softly, healing a blind man, raising a child from the dead, and looking at the broken masses with a gaze of infinite tender love. The people recognize him immediately. They weep, they fall to their knees, and they reach out to touch the hem of his garment. Just as the crowd is pressing around him, the Grand Inquisitor, an old, stern, 90-year-old cardinal who rules the city with an iron fist, arrives with his guards. Without a word, the Inquisitor has Jesus arrested, thrown into a dark, narrow prison cell beneath the stone floor, and locked away until morning. That night, the old cardinal visits Jesus in the dark prison cell. What follows is not a physical fight, but a long, agonizing, and deeply revealing psychological monologue where the Inquisitor explains to his silent prisoner why humanity does not want what Jesus came to offer them. The core argument of the Grand Inquisitor cuts straight to the bone of human psychology. He looks at Jesus and tells him that when he walked the earth centuries ago, he made a catastrophic mistake regarding human nature. He gave humanity absolute spiritual freedom. He gave them the right to choose between good and evil for themselves, to use their own conscience, and to bear the immense, agonizing weight of moral responsibility. The Inquisitor looks at the silent figure of Christ and delivers a chilling indictment of our species, stating that nothing is more seductive for man than his freedom of conscience, but nothing is a greater source of agony. Think deeply about what the Inquisitor is saying here, because it hits every single one of us right where we live. True freedom is terrifying. When you are truly free, nobody is going to tell you what to believe, how to live, what career to choose, or how to define your moral worth. You have to figure it out for yourself. Every choice you make carries real weight, real consequences, and the terrifying possibility of failure, regret, and guilt. If you mess up your life, you cannot blame a king, a church, or a set of rigid rules. You have to look in the mirror and accept that you did it to yourself. That kind of freedom requires an enormous amount of psychological strength, emotional maturity, and courage. Because most people do not possess that kind of strength, the Inquisitor argues, humanity actually hates freedom. We are terrified of the open ocean of choice. We want someone to take the burden off our shoulders. We want miracle, mystery, and authority. We want someone to tell us what is right and wrong, give us daily bread to eat, keep us safe from harm, and organize our lives so neatly that we never have to experience the agonizing anxiety of independent thought. The Inquisitor tells Jesus that humanity traded away your heavy gift of freedom long ago, crawling back to the authorities, the institutions, and the dogmas that promise safety, certainty, and comfort in exchange for obedience. When you pull back the layers of this brilliant parable, you realize that Dostoevsky is not just talking about religion or the Catholic Church. He is talking about the fundamental human temptation to escape personal responsibility. Look around at the modern world, and you will see the Grand Inquisitor's philosophy running every single aspect of contemporary culture. Modern society is engineered from top to bottom to minimize friction, eliminate hard choices, and soothe the anxiety of existence. We look for systems, algorithms, ideologies, therapies, and safe spaces that promise to take away the burden of independent thought and moral struggle. We want comfort. We want security. We want someone else to handle the difficult questions of life so we can just scroll through our phones, eat our bread, and be amused. Dostoevsky uses the Grand Inquisitor to deliver a stark, uncompromising warning. A society that is completely engineered to eliminate all suffering, all friction, and all hard choices ends up destroying human dignity. When you design a world where nobody ever has to struggle, where nobody ever has to make a truly terrifying choice, and where no one is ever allowed to fail or suffer the consequences of their actions, you also design a world where nobody ever develops true character. You create a population of perpetual children, safe and well-fed, but utterly hollow, passive, and devoid of genuine depth. This brings us directly to Dostoevsky's understanding of how human character is actually built. Character is not something you are born with, and it is not something you can download from a self-help book or think your way into while sitting comfortably in your room. Character is forged through resistance. It is built through friction. To understand this clearly, think about how physical strength works in the natural world. If you want to grow strong muscles, you cannot just sit on a plush couch and wish for them. You have to pick up heavy weights, force your muscle fibers to tear, and push your body through physical pain and exhaustion. When the muscle heals, it rebuilds itself stronger, thicker, and more resilient than before. If you take a tree and grow it inside a climate-controlled greenhouse where there is zero wind, zero drought, zero frost, and zero competition, that tree will grow fast and tall. But its wood will be soft, weak, spongy, and completely useless for building anything that needs to withstand a storm. In contrast, a tree that grows high up on a jagged, rocky mountain cliff, battered by howling winds, frozen by brutal winters, and forced to squeeze its roots through solid, stubborn stone, develops a tight, twisted, unbreakable grain. That wood is dense, tough, and enduring because it earned every single inch of its existence through struggle. Dostoevsky applies this exact, uncompromising law to the human soul and to the architecture of our consciousness. He shows us that there is a massive gulf between a shallow psychology and a deep psychology. A shallow psychology is built entirely on the pursuit of comfort, immediate gratification, social validation, and the total absence of friction. It produces individuals who panic at the very first sign of emotional discomfort, who fall apart when things do not go their way, and who lack the inner resilience to handle the real tragedies of life. They live on the surface of reality, drifting wherever the cultural winds happen to blow them, never anchoring themselves to anything real because they have never had to fight for anything meaningful. On the other hand, what we might call the Dostoevskian soul, a deep, authentic, resilient human consciousness, is always forged in the crucible of crisis, betrayal, existential doubt, grief, and intense self-reckoning. It is built by people who have stood at the edge of the abyss, looked down into their own darkness, faced their worst failures, and refused to run away. Suffering acts as an acid that burns away all our superficial masks, our narcissistic defenses, and our childish illusions of control. When your life is going smoothly, you can easily lie to yourself about who you are. You can maintain a fantasy that you are noble, generous, brave, and wise. But when a sudden crisis hits, when you lose someone you love, when your career collapses, when you commit a terrible mistake, or when you are forced to make an impossible choice, all those comfortable lies are instantly stripped away. You are left standing naked in the cold, forced to confront your true limitations, your weaknesses, and your actual capacity for courage. This is precisely what one of Dostoevsky's most beloved characters, the wise elder Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov, tries to teach those who come to him for guidance. Zosima speaks of love, but he gives a warning that shocks people who are used to cheap, sentimental ideas of happiness. He says that love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. Loving people in our imagination, dreaming about being a good person, and wishing well for humanity from a distance is easy and comforting. But real love, the kind that requires patience with difficult people, sacrifice for those who have hurt us, and the willingness to bear the burdens of another human being is hard, messy, and painful. It costs us our ego. It costs our pride. It costs our comfort. Real character, real wisdom, and real human depth cost something. They require you to walk through the fire of difficulty without hardening your heart into bitterness. When you look at people who possess genuine gravitas, empathy, and wisdom, you will almost always find that they have been through deep waters. They have suffered, they have doubted, they have broken down, and they have had to rebuild their lives from the ashes of their mistakes. They didn't get there by taking the easy path, or by letting someone else carry the burden of their freedom. They got there by stepping up, taking full responsibility for their choices, and letting the friction of life polish away their rough edges. Dostoevsky's insight here challenges the entire direction of modern life. We spend so much of our time, energy, and money trying to insulate ourselves from discomfort. We medicate our sadness. We run away from difficult conversations. We avoid commitments that might require sacrifice. And we seek out environments where our opinions are never challenged and our feelings are never hurt. We think we are protecting ourselves and building a better life. But Dostoevsky warns us that in our desperate quest to eliminate all pain, we are actually starving our souls. We are trading our deep, authentic potential for a shallow, comfortable prison cell designed by our own desire for safety. When you embrace the Dostoevskian view of freedom and character, you stop seeing every obstacle, every heartbreak, and every difficult season as a tragic design flaw in the universe. You begin to understand that these trials are the very hammer and anvil shaping your soul. Freedom is a heavy, terrifying gift, and character is a rare, hard-won achievement. If you want to become a deep, authentic human being, you have to stop running away from the friction of existence. You have to step out of the comforting illusions provided by the Grand Inquisitors of the modern world. Pick up the heavy, beautiful burden of your own freedom, and let the trials of life carve out a depth within you that nothing can ever destroy. When we journey through the dark, twisting corridors of Fyodor Dostoevsky's psychological universe, we are forced to confront some of the most uncomfortable truths about the human condition. We have walked through the damp, resentful basement of the underground man, where people nurse their wounds like precious treasures and secretly cling to their misery because it provides a twisted sense of identity and a shield against risk. We have stood in the feverish courtroom of Raskolnikov's conscience, watching how moral transgression shatters the human ego, and proving that guilt is not just a bad feeling, but the fierce, burning alarm system of a living soul. And we have stared up at the Grand Inquisitor, recognizing the profound temptation to trade away the terrifying, beautiful burden of freedom for the cheap, numbing anesthesia of safety and comfort. Now, we arrive at the final and most crucial destination of this psychological exploration. What do we do with all of this? How do we take these heavy, brilliant insights and apply them to our actual, messy, everyday lives? Dostoevsky was not writing as a detached academic sitting in an ivory tower theorizing about human nature from a safe distance. He wrote from the absolute center of human suffering. Throughout his life, He faced staggering personal catastrophes that would have completely broken most people. He stood before a firing squad, waiting for the fatal bullet, only to have his mock execution stopped at the very last second as part of a cruel psychological torture. He spent years of his life doing brutal hard labor in a Siberian prison camp among murderers and thieves, chained at the wrists and ankles in freezing, filthy conditions. He suffered from severe, debilitating epileptic seizures that left him mentally exhausted and physically shattered for days. He struggled with a catastrophic gambling addiction that repeatedly left him penniless, humiliated, and begging creditors for mercy. And he experienced the devastating, heartbreaking loss of his own children. Because Dostoevsky lived through these unimaginable trials, his psychology is never naive, and it never relies on cheap, toxic positivity. He never tells us to just smile through the pain, look on the bright side, or pretend that everything happens for a reason in some comforting, magical way. He knew that pain is often brutal, blinding, and destructive. But through his own life and through the complex arcs of his unforgettable characters, he discovered a vital distinction that changes everything about how we approach our struggles. He realized that there are two entirely different trajectories of suffering, and which one you experience depends entirely on what you choose to do with your wounds. The first trajectory is what we can call destructive suffering. This happens when a person experiences pain, heartbreak, or failure, and meets it with bitterness, blame, resentment, and a permanent desire for revenge. This is the exact trap that swallows the underground man whole. When you choose destructive suffering, you take your pain and turn it into a weapon against the world. You convince yourself that you are an innocent victim of a cruel, unfair universe, and you use your past trauma as a permanent license to remain stagnant, angry, and closed off from humanity. You build a wall around your heart, refusing to trust anyone, refusing to take responsibility for your future, and nursing your grievances like an open sore that you refuse to let heal. When your suffering is destructive, it traps you in a loop of endless psychological regression. You become smaller, more rigid, and more bitter with every passing year. Your world shrinks until it is nothing more than a tiny, dark cell of self-pity. Dostoevsky showed us that many people live and die in this exact state, choosing the familiar, predictable hell of their resentment over the terrifying, uncertain labor of personal growth. They let their pain destroy them from the inside out, turning their soul into a hardened, brittle shell that shatters at the slightest hint of further friction. But there is a second trajectory, one that leads toward genuine redemption and profound human depth. This is redemptive suffering. Redemptive suffering does not mean you go looking for pain, and it certainly does not mean you accept abuse or mistreatment. Dostoevsky was never a proponent of pointless masochism. Redemptive suffering happens when unavoidable pain, crisis, failure, or grief arrives in your life. And instead of running away, numbing yourself, or screaming at the heavens, you consciously choose to carry the weight. You look your mistakes in the eye, you accept full accountability for your choices, you allow your false pride to be burned away, and you refuse to let your heart turn into stone. In his remarkable semi-autobiographical book, The House of the Dead, which chronicled his years inside the Siberian prison camp, Dostoevsky observed the men around him with intense psychological curiosity. He was surrounded by convicted murderers, violent criminals, and hardened outlaws. Yet, because he was paying close attention, he noticed something fascinating. He saw that the prisoners who survived spiritually, the ones who emerged from that brutal hell with their humanity intact, were not the ones who hardened their hearts, acted like tough guys, and swore revenge against the guards and society. The men who survived with their souls intact were the ones who maintained an inner life. They were the ones who quietly reflected on their sins, felt genuine remorse for the damage they had caused, learned to care for the suffering of the other convicts around them, and refused to let their environment rob them of their capacity to feel empathy. They took their suffering, heavy and agonizing as it was, and used it as a forge to shape their character. They did not let the cold freeze their humanity. They let the fire of their trials burn away their superficial vanities, leaving behind a core of genuine wisdom, humility, and strength. How do we translate this Dostoevskian paradigm into practical, everyday psychology for our modern lives? How do we ensure that our own inevitable pain makes us deeper instead of destroying us? We can break this down into 4 foundational pillars of psychological integration. First, you must stop escaping the friction. We live in an age that treats every uncomfortable emotion like a dangerous emergency. If you feel anxious, you immediately reach for your phone to distract yourself. If you feel sad, you look for a quick fix or a medical label to take the edge off. If a relationship gets difficult, you walk away before having a hard conversation. We run from anxiety, heartbreak, failure, and existential doubt as if they are toxic poisons. But Dostoevsky teaches us that these very experiences are the raw materials of psychological maturation. Anxiety is often just the feeling of your mind expanding to handle a new level of responsibility. Heartbreak is the painful cracking open of an ego that was too small to hold real love. Failure is the undeniable reality check telling you that your current strategy is broken and needs to be reinvented. When you stop running away from the friction, when you sit quietly with your discomfort and allow yourself to feel it fully without immediate escape, you stop stalling your own growth. Second, you must ruthlessly examine your secondary gains. When you find yourself stuck in a rut, complaining about the same miserable situation week after week, you need to pull out Dostoevsky's psychological scalpel and perform some surgery on your own motives. Ask yourself the hard, brutal questions that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What am I actually getting out of this misery? Am I using my anxiety, my past trauma, or my difficult childhood as a convenient shield to excuse myself from taking risks? Am I playing the victim because it gives me sympathy, attention, and a ready-made narrative without requiring any actual effort on my part? Until you drag these hidden secondary gains out into the light and dismantle them, you will remain a slave to your own wounds. You cannot heal a wound that you are secretly using as a weapon or an excuse. Third, you must completely dismantle your intellectual pride. Like Raskolnikov, many of us try to outsmart our own pain. We use our intelligence, our philosophy, or our cynicism to rationalize our bad behavior and protect our fragile egos. We create elaborate mental gymnastics to prove that we are right, that the world is broken, and that we bear no responsibility for our own stagnation. Dostoevsky shows us that this kind of intellectual pride is a dead end. Eventually, the weight of reality catches up to you. Your clever theories will collapse under the pressure of actual life. When you make a mistake, when you hurt someone, or when your life falls apart, stop trying to intellectualize your way out of it. Drop the clever arguments, stop looking for loopholes, and accept the heavy, humbling reality of your choices. Confess your flaws to yourself, face the guilt without flinching, and accept accountability. That surrender of intellectual pride is terrifying, but it is also the exact moment real healing begins. Fourth, you must convert your pain into compassion. This is the ultimate metric of a Dostoevskian transformation. When you suffer, your immediate, natural instinct is to turn inward, wrap yourself in self-pity, and become bitter toward a world that hurt you. But if you allow your suffering to make you bitter, your suffering has defeated you. The true test of an integrated soul is what happens to your heart after it has been broken. Does your pain turn you into a cynical, hardened judge who looks down on everyone else's struggles? Or does it grant you a profound, tender, and unshakable understanding of the brokenness in other human beings? When you have walked through the fire of your own grief, anxiety, and failure, you suddenly possess a lens that allows you to see the hidden pain in the people around you. You stop judging strangers for their flaws, because you recognize the exact same darkness and weakness inside your own heart. Your pain becomes the bridge that connects you to humanity instead of the wall that isolates you from it. When you look at life through this deep, unyielding lens, everything shifts. You stop praying for an easy life. You stop wishing for a frictionless utopia where nobody ever gets hurt, where every day is comfortable, and where you never have to face a difficult choice. You realize that such a life would produce a shallow, fragile, and utterly meaningless existence. You begin to welcome the storms, the challenges, and the heavy responsibilities, not because you enjoy hurting, but because you know what they are capable of producing. Fyodor Dostoevsky leaves us with a timeless, bracing challenge. He reminds us that the human soul is not a fragile piece of glass to be kept in a climate-controlled display case, protected from every speck of dust and every sudden shock. The human soul is more like iron. To be forged into something strong, beautiful, and deeply enduring, it has to be thrown into the blazing fire, hammered relentlessly on the anvil of reality, and quenched in the cold waters of hard experience. Do not run from the pain that life is asking you to carry. Do not hide in the basement of resentment. Do not try to outsmart your own conscience with clever excuses. And do not trade your freedom for the comfortable prison of a safe, unexamined existence. Step out into the arena, take full responsibility for your choices, and let the trials of your life carve out an unshakable, magnificent depth within you, a depth that nothing in this world can ever take away.